Welcome to the channel where the past comes alive like a great and terrifying legend. Here, you will witness impossible victories, brutal betrayals, legendary commanders, and the darkest turning points in world history. The wind came first, then the dust, then the glitter of Persia, spreading across the plain before Dara like a second horizon made of iron, silk, and horseflesh. On that frontier, where empires stared at each other across heat and stone, history was not waiting for a legend. It was waiting to see whether a young Roman commander would be broken before his name had even begun. Before Belisarius became the man who would reclaim kingdoms, before Africa, before Italy, before the stories that would turn him into the last great captain of Rome, he was only a rising officer on the eastern edge of a wounded empire. Justinian had noticed him early, raised him from the imperial bodyguard, and given him command at an age when most men were still proving they deserved to stand near power. It was a dangerous gift. The Roman East was under pressure, the Persians were confident, and the frontier had already seen humiliation. Belisarius had recently failed to protect work on a new fortress near the border, and men had died or gone into captivity. If he failed again, he might vanish into the long graveyard of forgotten generals. Dara was not Rome. It was not even a rich city in the old sense. It was a hard frontier fortress in northern Mesopotamia, built to stare directly at Persia and to block the road from Nisibis, one of the great enemy strongholds of the east. This was the kind of place where diplomacy ended in hoofbeats. Stone walls rose above a plain that looked open and simple until an army entered it and realized how exposed a man could feel beneath the sky. When word came that the Persians were advancing to take Dara, Belisarius and the imperial officer Hermogenes understood at once what was at stake. If the city fell, the frontier bent. If the frontier bent, the empire bled. So Belisarius did something that great commanders often do before the world calls them great. He refused to wait for fate in a fixed position and began shaping the battlefield itself. A deep trench was dug before the city, not in a simple line, but in a broken pattern with angled sections and passages left open at key points. It was not glorious. It was not theatrical. It was cold, technical, almost mathematical. He was building channels for panic. He was deciding where Persia would believe it had room to move, and where that movement would kill it. On the Roman line stood cavalry on both wings, infantry drawn through the center, reserves positioned to strike where pressure became danger, and hidden possibilities waiting on the slopes. The army was not enormous, around 25,000 by Procopius's account, and the Persian host facing it was larger still, around 40,000 before more men came from Nisibis. The numbers alone should have told the ending, and yet the first thing the battle produced was not slaughter. It produced silence, staring, and insult. The Persian commander, Perozes, camped near Dara and sent a message so contemptuous it sounded almost like prophecy. He told Belisarius to prepare the bath because he intended to bathe inside the city on the next day. There, in one sentence, the entire war between Rome and Persia seemed to speak. Confidence against anxiety, prestige against necessity. The old imperial assumption that Roman men could be made to tremble if enough horsemen appeared before their walls. Belisarius answered not with rage, but with preparation. He also answered with words. He and Hermogenes sent a letter arguing that peace was the greatest blessing and that the best general was the one who could produce peace out of war. The Persians rejected it. The Romans wrote back again, saying they would stand with the help of God. Persia answered with its own gods, its own pride, and another promise to enter Dara. At the edge of battle, both empires still spoke the language of righteousness. They were only a few hours away from speaking the language of blood. Procopius, who served on Belisarius' staff and watched these campaigns unfold, preserved one of the strangest scenes in all ancient warfare. Before the full battle opened, a Persian horseman rode close and challenged the Roman line. No champion stepped out from the ranks of decorated officers. No famous noble answered him. Instead, a man named Andreas rode forward, not a formal soldier in the usual sense, but an attendant tied to Buzis, a man connected with a wrestling school in Constantinople. He struck the challenger down. Then another Persian came, older and more formidable, and Andreas killed him too. The men on the walls roared. The army roared. And for one heartbeat on that frontier, The enormous machinery of empire seemed to hesitate before the violence of a single obscure man. It was a small episode beside what followed, but it mattered. Morale is not abstract on the eve of battle. Sometimes it has a face, a knife, a fall into dust, and the sound of thousands shouting at once. Night passed. Dawn returned. Then the Persian army grew even larger. 10,000 more men came up from Nisibis, and now the field looked like the visible weight of an empire pressing forward. The Persians arranged their forces in depth, with fresh men ready to rotate into the struggle so the pressure would not weaken. The feared immortals, elite cavalry held in reserve, waited for the moment they would be unleashed. Belisarius answered with discipline. Buzes and Phares held one wing near the trench and the hill. Sunicas and Agon, hard cavalrymen of steppe stock, stood ready to reinforce. On the opposite side, John son of Nicidas and others held the far end with another reserve set at the angle. Belisarius himself stayed in the center with Hermogenes, not because the center was safest, but because that was where a commander could feel the whole line breathing. Morning stretched. Neither side moved. Heat gathered over the plain. Men waited under helmets while horses stamped the ground raw. Then Belisarius accepted a suggestion that reveals as much about his mind as any heroic charge ever could. Phares, the herald leader, proposed slipping away with his 300 men on a higher ground, out of sight, so that once the battle opened he could fall on the Persian rear. Belisarius agreed. That is one of the great differences between commanders who become myth and commanders who deserve it. The lesser men need to be seen controlling everything. The greater ones know how to hide a knife where the enemy will not notice it until the blade enters. At last, after midday, the sky darkened with arrows. Procopius says the missiles made a vast cloud, and the image feels exact. Shaft after shaft hissed through the dry air as if the light itself were being torn to pieces. The Persians had delayed the attack deliberately, believing the Romans would be weaker if forced to fight hungry later in the day. Their arrows came thick, helped by the rotation of fresh troops into the line. Men fell on both sides. Horses screamed, shields rang, and yet fortune tilted, just slightly, toward Belisarius. A steady wind was blowing from the Roman side into the faces of the Persians, checking the force of their arrows and turning a natural element into one more ally for the defense. Then the missiles were spent, and the killing moved closer. Spears lowered. Cavalry surged. The battle, which had seemed immense from a distance, suddenly became intimate enough for men to see each other's eyes. The first real crisis came on the Roman left. Persian forces under Pityaxes and the Catacini struck hard, broke the defenders, and sent them reeling back. It was the moment every army dreads, the instant where formation becomes fear and fear begins to spread faster than orders. But that was precisely the moment Belisarius had built the battlefield to survive. Sunicas and Agon thundered in from their supporting position, while Phares and his hidden heralds came down from the hill into the Persian rear. The attackers, so certain they were rolling up the Roman flank, suddenly found death in front of them, beside them, and behind them. The charge collapsed. The rout began. Thousands of Persians fell on that wing. The Roman line held. The trap had worked once. Now the whole field would decide whether it could work again. What came next was the part of battle that men remember least clearly and feel most deeply. Not the clean beginning, not the moment of speeches, but the middle, when dust thickens, when orders blur, when the world narrows to impact and noise and the terrible possibility that one side of the line is about to vanish. The Persians had been checked, but they were not broken. Not yet. Their commanders still had weight in reserve, and they still believed the Roman right could be crushed if hit hard enough. So they shifted strength toward that wing and prepared the strike they believed would finish the day. There, on the Roman side, stood men who knew exactly what it meant if they failed. There would be no elegant retreat, no gentle withdrawal back into safety. If the line split, Persian cavalry would pour through the openings, ride down the infantry, roll up the field, and turn Dara from a defended frontier city into a monument to Roman defeat. Then the immortals moved. The name alone carried menace. Persian elite cavalry, chosen and disciplined, glittering under the Mesopotamian sun like the sharp edge of imperial pride. They were not called forward to test the line. They were called forward to end the argument. When they rode, They did so with the confidence of men who expected history to obey them. Their armor flashed. Their horses drove up clouds of dust. Their advance was not a wave. It was a blade. They struck toward the Roman right with savage force, and for a moment the field tilted. Men were thrown back. Horses crashed into shields. Spears splintered. The trench that Belisarius had cut into the earth now did part of its silent work, breaking movement, distorting momentum, forcing attackers into channels where courage alone could not solve the geometry of death. But even with that advantage, the pressure was immense. This was the crisis at the heart of the battle, the instant when a famous defeat might still have swallowed an unknown commander before the world ever learned his name. Belisarius did not answer with panic. That may be the most important thing about him. Many men can be brave at the start of a battle. Fewer can stay cold when the center of the day begins to bend. He watched, he judged, and then the Roman reserves moved with the timing that separates discipline from disaster. Sunicus and Agon, already blooded by the fighting on the left, were committed again where the danger was greatest. The line did not lash out wildly. It closed, redirected, struck at angles, and used the enemy's own aggression against him. The Persian cavalry, pressing hard, found themselves doing what Belisarius had wanted from the beginning. They were no longer fighting the battle they had chosen. They were fighting the battlefield he had built. Some plunged too far and lost cohesion. Some became trapped in narrowing lanes of movement, with trenches disrupting the charge and Roman cavalry hitting where formation had loosened. The Roman right, which should have shattered under the blow of an elite assault, held long enough for the counterstroke to land. That is how battles are often saved, not by invincible men, but by ordinary men standing for a few more breaths than fear says they can. Then the killing accelerated. Procopius records that among the Persian dead was Belisarius, one of their leading commanders, cut down in the chaos. The loss mattered. Men do not need to count the dead to understand when something in an army's spirit has cracked. They feel it. They hear it in the changing pitch of shouts. They see it in the hesitation of riders who no longer believe the next charge will restore the field. They notice when those who were pressing forward begin instead to look sideways, then backward. Once that contagion begins, even brave soldiers can become a crowd of fugitives. And that is what happened at Dara. The Persians, who had come to take the city, who had come with superior numbers, who had promised themselves a bath within its walls, began to pull away from the line. Then they withdrew faster. Then they fled. The Roman army, battered but still coherent, drove the collapse home. Procopius gives the Persian losses as enormous, with many thousands dead. Ancient numbers always carry smoke around them, but the truth beneath the smoke is clear enough. This was not a minor repulse. It was a major Roman victory against a stronger eastern enemy on one of the most dangerous frontiers in the world. And all of it had been won not by miracle, but by intelligence. That matters, because the story of Belisarius can too easily become the story of a born legend, as if greatness arrived complete. Dara shows something more interesting and more human. It shows a young commander becoming himself under pressure. It shows preparation over vanity, restraint over theatrics, the careful arrangement of men, ground, timing, and reserves. It shows that before Belisarius conquered kingdoms, he first learned how to make a battlefield obey his mind. For Justinian, the victory mattered beyond the dead left on the plain. The eastern frontier had held. Persia had been bloodied. Confidence that invisible currency empires spend as often as gold flowed back toward Constantinople. A man who had been one defeat away from obscurity now stood in the bright and dangerous light of imperial notice. The empire had found something precious on the frontier, not merely a successful officer, but a commander capable of looking at impossible odds and seeing structure where others saw only doom. But victory did not mean peace. That is one of the darkest truths wrapped inside the triumph at Dara. Belisarius won brilliantly, and the war still went on. The following year, he would face a harder result at Callinicum, where the Romans suffered a serious reverse. The east remained unstable. Persia remained powerful. The frontier remained what it had always been, a place where today's savior could become tomorrow's scapegoat in a single afternoon of failure. Dara made Belisarius famous. It did not make him safe, and perhaps that is why this battle matters so much. Not only because it was a superb victory, not only because it launched one of the greatest military careers of late antiquity, but because it reveals the shape of Belisarius's whole life before the rest of the story unfolds. Again and again, he would save the empire. Again and again, he would carry Roman banners into situations that should have ended in ruin. And again, he would discover that empires love victory more than they love the men who deliver it. There is something almost tragic in that pattern. We like to imagine that history rewards genius cleanly, that once a man proves himself, the world opens before him. But the real world, the world Belisarius lived in, was harsher and more intimate than that. It was made of jealous courts, exhausted treasuries, suspicious emperors, frightened cities, and frontiers that never truly slept. In such a world, even brilliance was not freedom. It was service, sometimes glorious, often thankless, always temporary. Yet Dara endured in memory because it was the moment when possibility became destiny. On that plain outside the fortress, with Persia massed before him and defeat waiting like a living thing, Belisarius gave the empire a glimpse of what he could become. Not a reckless hero, not a myth wrapped in shining armor. Something rarer. A commander who understood that war is won as much by patience as by courage, as much by arrangement as by fury, as much by seeing clearly as by striking hard. He outwitted an empire before he ever became the terror of kingdoms. And that is the strange wonder at the heart of the story. Civilizations often seem to turn on cathedrals, laws, emperors, faiths, and grand declarations. But sometimes they turn because one young general on a frontier plain cuts trenches in the right places, trusts the right men, waits through the heat, and refuses to break when the larger army comes. War is full of kings and banners and names carved into stone. But beneath all that grandeur lies something colder. Empires survive because somewhere, someone holds a line that was expected to fail. Someone sees the shape of disaster a little sooner than everyone else. Someone turns fear into order long enough for the world beyond the battlefield to keep breathing. That is why Dara still matters. Because it reminds us that power is never as solid as it looks, that numbers do not always become destiny, and that the men who preserve a civilization are not always the ones history expected to find there. Thank you for watching. If this story stayed with you, leave a like and share in the comments whether Dara was the true birth of Belisarius the legend, or only the first warning of how much one man would be asked to carry for a fading empire. Stay curious, stay with us, and until the next journey,